The Jewish, the Christians, and the Muslims all built shrines near the top. In earlier times, when the city's walls protected a much larger area, the mount was actually inside the city gates. But when Suleiman the Magnificent rebuilt the walls in the 16th century, the mount was left outside. One of the holy sites on Mount Zion is the Tomb of David, often identified as the last resting place of the Jewish king. Many historians say the tomb isn't old enough to hold David's remains, but it continues to be a popular site for pilgrims. Mount Zion is also the location of the cenacle, which is said to be one possible site of Christ's Last Supper, or Passover Seder. Many historians doubt the authenticity of this location, but nearly all agree that the Last Supper probably took place somewhere on Mount Zion. Today, there are a number of religious institutions on Mount Zion. There is a rabbinical seminary where young Jewish men study for a life steeped in the Mishnah and the Gemara, which makes up the Talmud, the codified oral law of Judaism. There are Christian institutions, including a seminary where young Greeks study for the priesthood. Mount Zion affords a wonderful view to the west into the modern city of Jerusalem, and to the east, the Mount of Olives. Today, the beautiful Mount of Olives and the surrounding Kidron Valley are dotted with Muslim and Jewish cemeteries. On the Mount of Olives, the Jews buried their dead by the tens of thousands. Today, the vast burial ground here is the largest cemetery in the world. To be buried here is to be, in the Jewish tradition, the first to awaken upon the coming of the new Messiah. The price for a burial on this highly strategic ground is over $50,000 per plot. The dead in Jerusalem have always, according to Jewish law, been buried outside the confines of the city. Thus, we can always know the city limits by the location of Jewish cemeteries at any given time in history. Because of the desire not to build or live on or near a cemetery, the old city has remained hemmed in by graves on all sides and has expanded very little except in the last century. Jerusalem abounds with underground tombs as well as above-ground cemeteries. The cool, haunting interiors of these crypts can be explored by the more adventurous pilgrim. The very rich could afford magnificent burial sites, like the tomb of Absalom, the tomb of Zechariah, and the tomb of the Pharaoh's daughter in the Kidron Valley. Many date to the 7th century BC. Nearly 2,000 years ago, the Mount Zion region was also home to a devout group of Jewish clerics, the Essenes. In fact, many believe a gate named after the Essenes once existed in the general area where the Zion Gate is now located. The Essenes supported themselves by preparing Torah scrolls, writing the 5 books of Moses on thin sheepskin parchments. The Essenes are believed to have authored the famous Dead Sea Scrolls, which were found purely by accident in 1947. The scrolls were stored in ancient pottery jars in a desert cave near the monastery of the Essenes at Qumran. The well-preserved old scrolls, which date back to about 200 years before Christ, are believed to be the earliest manuscripts of the Old Testament, sacred to both Jews and Christians. The scrolls now rest in a dramatic museum known as the Shrine of the Book, which was designed to resemble the tops of the jars in which the scrolls were found. Many Jewish and Christians point to the similarity between some of the ancient preserved writings and the current Old Testament. They see this as evidence for the historical accuracy of the biblical texts through the centuries. The Essenes were people of extreme faith. They toiled for countless hours to make sure holy texts would be available to future generations. even though they believed the world would soon end. One fascinating parallel in the Muslim, Jewish, and Christian faiths is that the three groups trace their spiritual lineage back to the patriarch Abraham. Islam's most sacred book, the Quran, calls Abraham one who turned away from idolatry and came to his Lord with an undivided heart. The Quran calls Islam the religion of Abraham. Jewish and Christians alike claim Abraham as the ultimate ancestor of both their faiths. Many even trace the heavily Muslim Arab people to Abraham's son, Ishmael, and trace the Jewish people to Isaac, Ishmael's stepbrother. Yet this common lineage hasn't enabled the three groups to live together peacefully. The centuries of fighting between the Jewish people and the Muslims and the bloody Christian crusades indicate the history of misunderstandings that have historically overshadowed the shared background. However, despite their differences, Muslims, Jews, and Christians made one significant contribution to world history. Together, they held to the idea of one God. The peaceful reverence of Jerusalem's holy sites never seems to last long. Always war or terrorism or religious conflict comes along to disturb the worship. For instance, following the 1948 War of Independence, the next major battle came in 1967, a sudden and violent upheaval called the Six-Day War. The Six-Day War began on June 5th, when the Israelis became concerned about an Egyptian naval blockade in the Suez Canal and the Red Sea. Under the Jewish commander Moshe Dayan, Israeli forces liberated Gaza and the Sinai Peninsula, as well as the West Bank and the Golan Heights. In Jerusalem, the Jewish army struck Jordanian positions in the Old City, attacking through the Lion's Gate. There was fierce house-to-house fighting in the tiny alleyways and twisting streets of the Old City. But within hours, Jerusalem was under Jewish control. For the first time in thousands of years, the Jewish nation possessed the Western Wall and the other holy sites. The years to follow have been eventful and often bloody in the Old City, but the Jewish faithful still pray freely at the Western Wall. Muslims still control the Dome of the Rock on the Temple Mount. And Christian pilgrims still openly trace Christ's footsteps around the 14 stations of the cross. But the mystery is, what does the future hold for Old Jerusalem? Perhaps the future can be seen through the Old City's only sealed gate, the spectacular Golden Gate, the Gate of Destiny. Believers from all the faiths in Jerusalem instinctively realize that the future holds big things for the ancient Golden Gate. The Golden Gate is actually a huge double entrance, the only gate to cut directly through the city wall into the sacred Temple Mount area. Arabs refer to the southernmost of the two openings as the Gate of Mercy, and the northernmost as the Gate of Repentance. This reflects their belief that the gate will someday be part of the last judgment of man at the end of history. The original gate was apparently constructed in the 7th century by the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius. Legend has it that the gate was built to allow Emperor Heraclius to return a sacred relic, believed to be from Christ's cross, to the Holy Sepulchre in the city. It is said that the emperor built the gate to allow his army to make a triumphant entrance into the city, proudly bearing the sacred prize. Later, when the city came under Muslim control, the gate was completely walled in,